Nice to be introduced as Dapper. So I'm conscious that I'm one of the things that stands in between you and your lunch. And that also I have a background in philosophy. So taken together, if you want to have a little snooze now, that's totally fine. Yeah, I am an author and philosopher. I've also just set up a new business called Dynamics of Power, because it seems to me, again and again, this issue of power comes up in organizations, in politics, in personal relationships, and of course in technology. And I do want to talk a little bit about this theme of power in relation to humans and technology. But I don't want to spend too much time on the question of who's winning. You know, are we going to lose all our jobs to robots, or are all those jobs being displaced into something else? I'll touch on that, but what I really want to talk about is the power we have over ourselves and ourselves as technology, as things that can be trained and that can acquire skills, but that we can acquire those in a quite different way. So that's what I'm going to come on to. Just to put it into a bit of historical context, taking a pretty long view here, I think we're in the midst of, it's not new to say this, but pretty extraordinary times. I think many of you would agree with that. But my take on what makes them extraordinary is perhaps, comes, as I say, from this sort of philosophical background. Because I think two contrary macro forces are coming together at the moment, both in relation to the Enlightenment. So the Enlightenment, just to remind you, was and perhaps still is a sort of movement associated with the 18th century that foregrounded reason, empirical observation, science, and objectivity over things like superstition, belief, religion, subjective viewpoints, and so on. And the Enlightenment was the sort of scientific and philosophical underpinning behind the Industrial Revolution and the creation of measuring instruments and machines and so on. And in fact, this very institution, in a certain sense, is an embodiment of or a representation of the Enlightenment ideal, Enlightenment spirit. So that's what I mean by enlightenment, as opposed to the sort of Buddhist notion of enlightenment as, you know, transcending to a higher sphere. Of course, that too is desirable. So two things I think are going on in relation to that Enlightenment legacy. One is what I would call a complete counter-enlightenment. For decades or centuries, we've made progress in terms of science and objectivity and analysis and measurement, and that's led to all sorts of benefits, and particularly, you know, health, for example, informatics, and so on. And yet we are seeing a trend in the world to do with fake news, a mistrust of experts, a devolution to the personal subjective views, which suggests that regardless of what experts think or what the objective truth might be, our own personal or subjective view, whether it's climate change, denying climate change, for example, or even this new peculiar movement that insists that, in fact, the Earth is flat, yes, are, in fact, on the rise. And there is more possibility to do that, thanks, of course, to the technologies we're familiar with, which allow for this proliferation of subjective voices. You know, if I believe the Earth is flat and I get enough followers, suddenly we're in this sort of filter bubble whereby that becomes my reality, it becomes true. And it's a kind of version of fake news. If I say it's true and I have enough support, then it's kind of true. And of course, if perception is reality, it does have a working veracity to it, which people can get behind. And we're seeing that, of course, fake news is the most obvious example. We've known it for a while in terms of kind of propaganda, but the ability to manipulate information and distort it in order to suit our subjective views is one of the most concerning, perhaps, and most prominent ways in which the progresses of the Enlightenment, the advances of the Enlightenment, are actually being reversed. So I think it's fair to say we are in a counter-Enlightenment movement, an anti-scientific, anti-intellectual, which is part of a class movement, which is anti-middle class, anti-elite sort of phenomenon. So that's happening on the one side. But the story, as ever, is never simple. For every movement, there's a counter-movement. And on the other side, I think we have, if that's a counter-enlightenment, I think on the other side we'd have what I would call a hyper-enlightenment. Because wherever we go now, everything is counted, everything is objectified, data is multiplied. We know, I know I only have to look at my phone, I know how many steps I've taken, how many heartbeats I've had. If I want to, I can tell how many calories I've consumed and so on. And we're increasingly subject to data and evaluation and quantification. And this is affecting all of our lives all of the time. And we're aware of it in slightly sinister ways these days, as we know that big tech firms and others are collecting our data, potentially mining it, using it for uses which we're not entirely sure about. And of course, in the worst examples, that data being used by people with nefarious ends to hack our accounts, manipulate our data for felonious reasons. So I think this is what's going on a global scale at the moment. We have the intersection of two quite contrary forces, what I would call a hyper-enlightenment and a counter-enlightenment at the same time. I want to talk a bit, though, about that hyper-enlightenment, because this multiplication of data and quantification and so on is leading us to think that the world is being taken over by algorithms. And, you know, to a degree it is, and we may or may not win that battle over technology and data that's coming before us. Oh, it says my time's already over. Look at that. You see, I'm being measured. I'm being measured. My title is Humans versus Tech, Who Holds the Power? Clearly, in this case, I've lost, you know, game over. Oh well, anyway, it was nice talking to you, and I will try and be very quick, though. I just want to make a couple of points. We can think of ourselves as technologists. The word technology comes from a Greek word, techne, which means skill. And it's worth saying that we as human beings are trainable, as we all know. We are skillable entities. And even though we might be in some sort of negative dialogue with machines some of the time, we do have the ability to learn. But I just want to quickly share with you or introduce you a notion of learning which might be unusual to you. And it's the learning that comes from the place when we're in a state of uncertainty rather than certainty. Learning happens actually not when we're in a state of competence, but when we're in a state of non-competence. Those of you who have children will know that they go to school and every day they come home having not been able to do something and then mastering it. And of course, this is a situation that we have had as children ourselves. When we were at school, we weren't able to master things, and then we were. And it's that transition from non-competence to competence that is learning. But the non-competence is an essential phase of learning. It's the not knowing, it's the uncertainty that puts us in the space of the ability to learn. So although we talk a lot about skills in an instrumental way, as though we're going to get a skill and acquire it, the more we sort of rush at that in a cognitive way, the less likely we are to sort of tarry with that uncertainty and the kind of broadness and openness that it gives us. And really this is a plea for types of learning and experience which take us genuinely out of our comfort zone, into the non-competent, into the unconscious, because I think it's only in those spaces that we really develop the skills, the new skills, and the non-mastery from which mastery ultimately comes. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you.